Great. So again, thank you all so much for joining us here this afternoon. Again, my name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. And we're here this afternoon for an armchair travel presentation. I've shortened the title to Hidden Treasures of Boston. But this is one in a series of Boston armchair travel presentations that Jay has. And I'm sure all will go well this afternoon, and we'll have Jay back for some of his additional presentations. So today we're going to get an inside look at some of Boston's hidden treasures from popular Boston tour guide Jay Bazzanotti, a corporal in the 1st New Hampshire Regiment of Revolutionary War reenactors. Jay will appear in full uniform to talk about some of the little-known landmarks and monuments in the Boston area. Much of the city's rich and fascinating history is invisible, not just to the casual visitor, but also to those who have lived here all their lives. And again, this afternoon's presentation is sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library. So all 80 of us or so that are here live on Zoom, and I'm sure the dozens that'll be watching on demand on YouTube, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jay for joining us here this afternoon. And Jay, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. You're too kind for the applause, the virtual applause. My name is Jay Bazzanotti. I am an amateur tour guide and have been giving tours of Boston for about 35 years. I'm also a reenactor of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, the very first unit to be inducted into the United States Army, 1775, right here in Medford, Massachusetts, where the U.S. Army was formed. So the presentation that I'm giving will last about an hour, maybe a little bit longer. I'll try not to bore you. I hope you'll find it entertaining. The presentation is broken into 2 parts. The first part are cool things that come from Boston, and every one of the presentations in this series starts with this cool things that come from Boston, because so many cool things have come from Boston. We are the hub of the universe, after all. The second part of the presentation is about things that are hidden in plain sight. Things that you might look at every day and wonder about, or things that you didn't know that were there that are very cool. I've been walking around the city for all these years, looking at these things, and I've always wanted to put a presentation together to share my fascination with those things. And with that, I hope I will be able to begin now, pending technical difficulties. Yay, it worked. This never works. First part of the presentation are cool things from around Boston. Okay, 1774, one of the greatest things in the world, the steel shovel. Before Captain Ames made the steel shovel, most shovels were made out of wood. Can you imagine doing the kind of work you would have to do with a wooden shovel? And if you go to Sturbridge Village or Mystic, Connecticut, or some of those other places, you can still see wooden shovels. As time went on, the Ames Plow Company came up with the steel shovel. They helped with the discovery of gold and caused a rush on shovels. They went to work with the Transcontinental Railroad, which, by the way, was an amazing thing that you never hear about, that while the Civil War was being fought, Lincoln was making sure the Transcontinental Railroad moved forward as well. Think about that for a little while. Empire Express is a great book on that topic. And the Ames family, who by then were among the most powerful and wealthy families, not just in America, but in the entire world, they helped pay for the Transcontinental Railroad and also used their influence in their politics to propel it along. During the Civil War, the U.S. Army standardized on the Ames shovel. The pack shovel was partially invented with the help of the Ames Company so that soldiers could have a small shovel to carry on their back that they could use in the field. By the turn of the century, by 1900, 80% of all the shovels sold in the entire world were made by the Ames Company. So they really were a big force in Boston. Not much is left of the Ames Company today. You can see the Ames plant down in Easton, Massachusetts. This is a picture of it now. It's condos. However, the Ames mansion in Boston is by itself a hidden gem. You can no longer go in it. It was bought by an Arab man who has turned it into 12 enormously expensive and beautiful condominiums. The Ames were in that place until about the mid-'80s when Emerson College bought it and they sold it to this entrepreneur in the past, I don't know, five years or so, and he converted it into condos. Uncle Sam comes from Boston. He was born in Arlington in 1766. And I want to say that when I say Boston, I mean Boston and the environs. So I hope you won't jump on me because some of these things come from around Boston. Uncle Sam Wilson was born in Arlington in 1766. And later on, we'll see his monument that's there. He supplied beef to the U.S. during the War of 1812, and they were stamped U.S. for and he became synonymous with the country as a result of that. Later on, one of the hidden things that we'll see is the monument to Uncle Sam in Arlington. This is an incredible thing here, the railroad switch frog, 1825. So many amazing things came about at this time by this man, Gridley Fox Bryant, who was one of the unsung heroes of America. He was a lovable rogue, a kind of corrupt architect contractor who made sure that Boston propelled itself to becoming the hub of the universe. He built the first commercial railroad in America out in Milton, Quincy now, and you can still see it. We'll actually see a picture of it later. And one of the things he invented was this railroad frog, this little X that you've seen on railroads before that allow trains to cross over tracks so that they can go in different directions. He also invented the roundhouse and where the trains could go on and be turned around. He did not patent any of these ideas, and they were used all over the world. They're still used today with very little change. The United States government thought that the railroad frog was such an important invention that it was sent to the Columbia Exhibition of 1893. So this frog, the original frog, still exists, and it's in Milton. It's in East Milton Square. It has a little park built around it. You can go in the square and see the original railroad frog. The friction match. Okay, now I'm going to get a lot of abuse from people who will say, oh no, the friction match was made in Europe. The first American patent for friction match came from here, Massachusetts, Boston, Springfield. And it was better than the friction matches that came from Europe. These friction matches, before then, they were little glass balls that were filled with chemicals. Some of them were as long as your arm. So, and when you broke the glass ball, the chemicals would mix with the air and spontaneously combust. These were sulfur on a stick. It's incredible, it cannot be underestimated or how important or overestimated the invention of the match was at the time. Before that, if you wanted to start a fire, you had to use flint and steel, or if you wanted to light your pipe or your cigarette or your cigar, you would use a thing that was called spill. And there was an entire industry of men who did nothing but make curlicues of wood using a spill plane. And you can buy spill planes on eBay. And these things, you would use a piece of spill, which was a thin shaving of wood, to carry the flame to your cigar or to the fireplace or to the lamp, because there were no matches then. Matches were very dangerous in those days. And in fact, they were dangerous up until probably 50 years ago. When I was a child, my father would say, never carry a match in your pocket with a coin, because the match could set itself on fire in your pocket. So the friction match, another great thing from Boston. The steam shovel. This thing is still in use today, although they don't use steam anymore. Was invented by William Otis Smith in Pelham in 1839. This was an incredible invention that was used to help fill in the Back Bay. All of Needham, Massachusetts, is now called Needham Heights, but it was once filled with hills. And the company of Munson and Goss cut those hills down, brought the soil into Boston, and filled all of the Back Bay. Now, many people had tried to build steam shovels before Smith, but if you look at the picture, you can see the little wheel in the middle. That was the thing that was critical to the invention. It was called the crowd and the thrust. It makes that arm go back and forth that allows it to pick up the soil, then move it over to a train car or another pile and dump it. As children, maybe many of you read the book Mike Mulligan's Steam Shovel. And in that book, the steam shovel was named Mary Ann. And the reason why was because the biggest steam shovel company in America was called the Marion Steam Shovel Company. They were located in Ohio. Their steam shovel was based on this design and later went on to dig the Panama Canal. And one of those steam shovels is now abandoned in New York, in Leroy, New York. It's called the Marion Leroy. It is a massive, massive machine. And what has come from that is Marion Steam Shovel Company became the Dresser Company, which makes the gigantic crawler that the space shuttle and all our spaceships sit on down in Cape Canaveral. And when you see that crawler, it has its origins right here with this steam shovel you're looking at in this picture. So another great thing from Boston, Baker's chocolate. Chocolate, the way that people eat it in the world today, was invented here in Boston, in Dorchester, by two men, Hannon and Baker. Hannon died in a ship sinking, and Baker took over the mill. And he developed the Baker chocolate mills in Dorchester, which were making chocolate up till about 1965 when the plant was bought out. So the plant was abandoned and became desolate. It was really a horrible place. Used to drive by it all the time. It looked like Willy Wonka's factory that was abandoned with broken windows and whatnot. It was massive. It was one of the biggest factories in the world. In World War I, it made more chocolate than any other factory in the world. And chocolate, of course, was given to the soldiers. When the factory warehouse tanks were knocked down in the 1980s, the entire air was filled with chocolate dust, and you could smell the chocolate for miles around. I happened to be there when that happened, and I absolutely couldn't believe it, because as a child, when they made chocolate, the whole area smelled like chocolate. You can still get Baker's chocolate today, had its origins right here in Boston. The sewing machine, another cool thing, invented here in Boston by Elias Howe. He invented this sewing machine, and while he was in Europe trying to sell it, Isaac Singer stole his idea and started selling it. But when he came back and saw what was happening, he went to court and sued Singer, and Singer had to pay him royalties for every machine he sold. And later they joined forces, and that's how we get Singer sewing machines today. Teeth casting for forensics. How many times have you watched CSI on TV and they cast teeth to catch the murderer? That was invented here during the murder as a result of the murder of the century, the murder of George Parkman. George Parkman was one of the richest men in Boston. His son's house is still there on the other side of Beacon Hill. You can actually see it, and it's an interesting story to that as well. Parkman went to collect a rent from a college professor at Harvard named John Webster, who was the cousin of lawyer Daniel Webster. And what Webster did was he couldn't pay his debts, so he killed Parkman, cut him up, burned him up in acid, and then threw the bones in the outhouse. However, his janitor, whose name was Littlefield, saw what had happened, and then when the body disappeared, he dug up the bones, went to the police. The police arrested Webster, but in those days, there was no way to prove that those were the bones of Parkman. So the police went to Harvard University and said, can you find a way for us to verify that this is Parkman? And they cast his teeth and went to his dentist, and they proved beyond doubt that he was, in fact, the murder victim. Webster was found guilty, and he was hung on Boston Common at the hanging tree. This case was visited by famous people all over the world who came to watch it in court. And when he was hung, his son, George Parkman Jr., donated the money for all the trees that are in Boston Common now, and he built the Parkman Bandstand, which is in Boston. He bought a house on Beacon Hill that oversaw the hanging tree, so he could always see the revenge he got for the man who killed his father. In 1954, the case was reopened, and some doubt was cast on whether it really was Webster, and the people who looked at it suggested that it really was Littlefield, the janitor who fingered Webster, who probably killed Parkman, because Littlefield was a grave robber who would get $25 for every body he sold to Harvard doctors studying anatomy. And so we may never really know what happened, but a lot of evidence points to the fact that Webster was innocent and Littlefield was the guilty party. The fire alarm was invented here. Yay, anytime you see one of these little red boxes, you know that those were invented here in Boston by William Francis Channing. His father was the minister of the Arlington Street Church, which is also part of this series. And it was bought by Gainwell, who still makes them today. That company was in South Carolina. The government seized it from South Carolina after the Civil War, but they bought it back. They still control 95% of the fire alarm industry. And Firebox #1 is in Pie Alley in Boston. You can still see it. That area where Pie Alley is in Boston is one of the most exciting places for things to see in all of Boston. You can stand in the street and make a circle and see something at almost every single position. I love taking people there to show them all the cool stuff that happened. The burglar alarm was also invented here. And in fact, the cool thing about the burglar alarm, the very first burglar alarm, was that it worked the same way as they do today now. So that you see that when you buy a burglar alarm, that you put those two little things on your window, such that if you open up the window, the alarm goes off. That was invented back then in 1853, works exactly the same way today as it did back then. Came from Boston. Toilet paper, where would we be without toilet paper? Now, it is true that toilet paper was first used by the Chinese back in the 1400s, but somehow or other, the use of it disappeared, and I'm not sure why. In any event, it never made its way to Europe. People used all kinds of terrible things for toilet paper back in the day, old corn cobs and short end of the stick and sponges with vinegar and so on. You know, it was a pretty nasty thing until Joseph Gaiety developed what we would now consider to be baby wipes. They were little square sheets. They were wet. They were medicated with aloe. And as soon as he produced them, they were an immediate success. People bought them up like crazy. However, Gaiety was not a very good businessman. He had some outstanding debts that he forgot about, and he lost the entire company over a $25 bet. The company was worth millions even back then. At the same time, right after he invented this, the Scott brothers decided to put toilet paper on a roll up in Canada, and that's where we get the toilet roll today. Gaiety, even though he didn't have the business anymore, it was still called Gaiety's Medicated Paper, but it was put out of business by Northern Tissue, who still exists today, whose new advertising motto was, "Now splinter free." I want you to think about that for just a second, when a big bonus for your toilet paper is that it is splinter free. Baking powder was invented by an eccentric professor from Harvard named Evans Horton Horsford. He is also the man who put up the Leif Erikson statue on the Comm Ave Mall. It's at the very end of the mall. And that's one of the things that are in this series as well, one of the hidden parts of Boston. And he put up a Viking tower in Norumbega, which you can still see. Now, the door is locked. It's not a patrolled area. However, if you're live, you can actually crawl through the bottom window, which I've done a couple of times, and you can climb all the way to the top of the tower. And from the top of the tower, Horsford said you could see the Charles River where the Vikings came up the river. And if you go to Boston and see the Longfellow Bridge, you can see the Salt and Pepper Towers have two Viking ships on the very front of the tower. They were put there because Horsford had convinced everybody that the Vikings came right up Charles River, and that's what they represent. So another cool thing from Boston. The motorcycle was invented right here in Boston by a man named Sylvester Roper. It was not called that then. It was called a velocipede, or a motorized bicycle. It was powered by steam. He could go 30 miles an hour, and it was the wonder of the age. In 1867, there were really no street vehicles that were autonomous. You know, it was still the horse was still king. He would tool around the city on his motorcycle all the time. People pointed him out until he finally hit a tree, had a heart attack. When he hit his head and he died. The first motorized police vehicles were motorcycles, and they were used to chase bicycle riders. Bicycles were an enormous thing at the turn of the century. There was a great movement towards bicycles back in that day. Our friend Roper also invented lots of other cool things. Now, this thing is really awesome. How many of you have never seen a pipe wrench called the Stilson wrench? This thing was invented because because steam heat and plumbing with iron pipe had come to Boston, had come to the world. And until the standard Briggs threading, pipes were welded together and used pipe benders to make curves and turns. However, with the invention of the Briggs threading of pipes, this tool made plumbing common, easy, and cheap. It is the most important plumbing tool of the ages, still used today, still unchanged. Came from Boston, one of the greatest things that came from Boston. The paper bag was invented by Margaret Knight in Springfield in 1871. She was the first one to use a flat bottom bag. Until then, most paper bag-like things were more like Federal Express envelopes that we see today. Her bag could hold 75 pounds. The machine is still in operation. You can see it at the Waltham Museum of Industry. It sits off to a side, and sometimes they turn it on and it makes bags. One of the interesting things about this was at about the same time, the menstrual pad was invented by the Paul Hartmann Company in Germany in 1872. And because of the Comstock laws, buying these pads could be construed as an obscene act. So the paper bag was used to hide these things that women had to go into the store, buy them, put them in the bag, leave the money on the counter, and leave them within the bag. No male clerk could ever help them or take the money for these things. The telephone, of course, everybody knows that Alexander Graham Bell patented the telephone here in Boston. One of the cool things about this was there is a hidden Boston site, which we'll see later, on Cambridge Street where his lab was. And this is one of my pet peeves about Boston. His lab was dismantled in 1920 to widen the street, and Watson supervised the dismantling of the lab. It was put in the AT&T headquarters where it was a museum. And it was a museum up until about 20 years ago, in 2005, that 15 years ago, when it disappeared. A&T sold the museum to Verizon, and no one has seen it since. There was a famous mural that was above the museum that ended up in a private museum in Rhode Island. But all of Bell's equipment, his phone, his woodwork, everything is gone, and no one can tell you where it is. I've been looking for it ever since it disappeared. The safety razor, the razors that we use today, have their origin here in Boston by King Gillette. King Gillette was a wheeler dealer who was always looking for a way to get rich. And one day when he was going to talk to his lawyer and banker, he had to shave himself. And in those days, people used a straight razor, which was like taking your life in your hands. If you made a mistake, you would cut your throat. It was a very dangerous thing. And so he got an idea for the safety razor, but mostly he sold the blades. The thing was an immediate success. It was extremely expensive at the time, and yet people bought them like crazy. He got the rights to be the exclusive supplier for the military in World War I. At about that time, Gillette also came out with the first razors for women to shave their armpits. And their motto was, just like a French lady, or just like a French woman, when French women that didn't even shave their armpits at all. Now, this is a really interesting thing. This is the first purpose-built fire engine, came from Boston as well. Now there are a few big companies, LaFrance and Pierce and whatnot, that make fire engines. But in the 1850s, the first fire engines were invented that we know today, steam fire engines, were invented in England. And the story of them is very, very interesting, because what happened was, when the first fire engine was brought to a fire in England at the London Opera House, the firemen saw what it could do, and so they destroyed it because they were afraid it would put them out of business. So Newsom, the man who invented the fire engine, came to New York and he sold them the fire engine. And the fire engine in those days was a steam pumper pulled by horses. When the firemen in New York saw what the fire engine could do, they destroyed it because they were afraid that it would take their jobs away. So Newsom went to Boston and he sold a fire engine to the city of Somerville, and they took it to a fire. And when they saw what it could do, they destroyed it because they were afraid it would take their jobs. The fire engine didn't take off until Newsom was able to send an entire fleet of them to Cincinnati, and they couldn't all be destroyed, and they finally were accepted. This fire engine that came from Boston was a combination of gas engine or gasoline engine and the steam pumper itself. Until that time, these were horse-drawn affairs. But once gasoline vehicles came into being, the horse-drawn fire engine started to disappear. The last horse-drawn fire engine was retired in 1922. There was a big ceremony. It made a final run, and the horses were sent out to pasture. They were considered heroes. In Boston, because we had the fire of 1872, and everybody was afraid of fire in Boston, the last fire wagons drawn by horses weren't retired until 1938. At that time, my grandmother, who lived on the outskirts of Boston, was still renting stable space to the Boston Fire Department where they kept their horses. And of course, Fluffernutter, one of our favorite things, was invented here in Somerville in 1917. The PB&J sandwich came out in 1918. What can I say about Fluffernutter? I'll tell you a cool thing. Somerville has an enormous festival every year. I have a spelling mistake. So every September in Somerville, it's the Fluffernutter Festival. They have all kinds of things. At least 100,000 people go. It's enormous fun. If the COVID virus ever goes away, I highly recommend that you go to the Fluffernutter Festival and have a PB&J sandwich. The first vehicles in America came from here, from Boston, from this area around Boston. Of course, the car as we know it today was first made in Europe. Americans were probably 15 years behind the Europeans, and our cars were not really that good. They were called smoke wagons. The Doria brothers made the first car in America in 1893. And at that time, there were all kinds of cars. There were electric cars, there were steam cars, there were gas cars. Nobody knew which car was going to succeed. Eventually, it was the gas car. But for a long time, people thought the Stanley Steamer, which was made right here in Newton, and also had a big factory in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, they thought the Stanley Steamer would be the car because the Stanley Steamer was, without doubt, the best car in the world at the time. It was faster, more reliable, and better built than any gasoline car. And in fact, the Daytona 500 and the Indianapolis 500 were originally designed to put the Stanley Steamer and other steam cars out of business because only gas cars could be raced at those races. Another cool thing was that the only place outside of England that Rolls Royces were ever made was in Springfield, Massachusetts. And they made them for about 20 years. They were great cars. The first circumnavigation of the globe was started here in Boston in 1902 by Henry Glidden. Glidden was the vice president of AT&T. He was a partner of Alexander Graham Bell. And later on, he would be the first person to license pilots. Both Glidden and Alexander Graham Bell were very interested in flying in airplanes. And in fact, Alexander Graham Bell helped found the Canadian Air Force. Later on, 1 year later, the first transcontinental car trip started in San Francisco by a man named Jackson. It took 39 days to cross the country. It had nothing to do with Boston, but I thought it was interesting. And that's the end of the first part of the presentation. I hope you liked it. We will now move on to the hidden part of Boston. And these are things that are in plain sight, that are overlooked, are not commonly known. This is the first slide. This was the thing that got me started on doing this series in the first place. In 1942, there was a nightclub in Boston called the Coconut Grove, very, very popular nightclub, run by a mobster who had all the politicians in his pocket. And on this night in November, he had an overflow crowd in this building where all the exits were locked, and there were only revolving doors in the front to get in or out. Now, a couple down in the lower club decided to have a romantic moment and turned off the light over their table. The bartender sent a busboy over to turn the light back on, and he needed a match to see what he was doing. And he set the club on fire. And once the club caught on fire, and this was in seconds, nobody could get out of the building. 492 people died in this fire. It's the second worst fire in American history. The first one was in Chicago in like 1899, I think, at the Iroquois Theater. Even though this was a horrible fire, no official monument was ever raised to where this happened. Boston is a terrible city for recognizing bad fires and the deaths of all people that die in fires. And we'll see this over and over again through the decades. They tried to ignore it. This monument was put in the sidewalk on Piedmont Street. It's a private memorial put there by private people who donated the money to do it. And in fact, where it was is now where a condo is going up. The developer actually dug it up out of the ground and moved it one street over. So it's not where it was before. It is, however, still adjacent to where the actual door where the people couldn't get out was. So you can go to Bay Village and do a little investigation and find this, this monument to this horrible tragedy. And the horrible tragedy resulted in a lot of interesting things about how to treat burns that were discovered here at Mass General Hospital. So this was the thing that got me started doing this presentation. So it only seemed natural that this would be the first slide. This is one of my favorite things in Boston. It is the observation deck of the Independence Wharf. Independence Wharf was where Griffith's Wharf was, and that's where the Boston Tea Party was held. This building that you see is built on what used to be Griffith's Wharf, where the Tea Party was. And on the top there, you can see there's a little recessed building. There's an observation deck. It's part of the Harbor Walk. It's free. It's open every day. You go up to the 14th floor and you can go out and see the Greenway and the entire harbor is so totally excellent. The fact that it's free and that anybody can go, and the fact that nobody really does go is really amazing. And one of the cool things about it, it's a very, very romantic spot to bring your honey. You go up there, you have a little smooch while you look out at the harbor. And at the top picture here, one of the things you see is one of the views into South Boston. And one of the things you're looking at right there after that red and yellow is the Envoy Hotel, which is a new boutique hotel, which has a rooftop restaurant, which you can see is open even in the winter. They have little igloos that you can go into. At the bottom of this, when you walk out, you can go to James Hook Lobster and get a lobster al fresco, which I highly recommend. Highly, highly, can't say enough. James Hook Lobster is awesome. This is another one of my favorite things in Boston. It's the City Hall Model Room. It's hard to believe that this thing even exists. If you've ever watched the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know the part where Indiana Jones goes down into the map room of the building with the staff, and there's a little model of the city, and he has to set the staff up. Well, this is the real thing. This is a giant room filled with a gigantic wooden model of the entire city of Boston. And they have guided tours on Tuesdays. I imagine they don't have them anymore now because of COVID. But once we get past the COVID, they'll probably do it again. You have to get a reservation to get a guided tour, but you can go any other time if you don't want the tour. You can just walk around the model and see the entire city. And what they do is they use this model when developers come in and propose buildings. They pluck what's there out and they put the little wooden building in so they can look at the effect on the city of what the construction is going to look like. It's all basswood. It smells so good in there. It really is quite an incredible thing, and it's free. You know, this is so well worth going to see because it's free. Oop, I went the wrong way. I'm sorry. The Boston Public Library. When I bring people around, one of the places I love to take them is to the Boston Public Library. The atrium is the thing that I'm showing here. This library was built in 1895 by the firm of McKim, Mead and White. It is an absolutely incredible structure. It has this, in the center of the city, it has this bucolic little courtyard where you can get food from the indoor cafe and then sit outside and eat it. There's a quartet that plays music while you eat. It is so nice. It is so well worth doing. But the thing about this that I'm not talking about here, but I will later, is there's a 90-minute tour every day for free. And the library is also a museum. There are many incredible things in there. The thing I like to point out the most is the original waiting room, which has a gigantic mural series of the quest for the Holy Grail. In 1843, Lord Tennyson wrote The Lady of the Lake, the story of the search for the Holy Grail, King Arthur and the Round Table. And it was the Harry Potter of its day. It was so popular that when this library was built in 1895, 50 years later, it was still popular enough that a massive mural was built inside the library. And it tells the entire story of Sir Bors and Sir Galahad, the two knights, not King Arthur, who actually went after the Holy Grail. If there was only one place I could bring people to Boston, this would be it, and that tour. The Boston Stock Exchange is a very interesting thing for 5 minutes or so. This is a gigantic building on State Street, but originally it was an 11-story building, and it was considered the most important and frequently visited building in Boston, where all business was held when it was made in 1891. It was the wonder of the age. It had electric light, it had telephones, it had telegraph, it had stock tickers, it had newspapers, it had everything, even elevators. So it was going to be torn down in 1980 to build a large building there, but there was an outcry because of the architecture. So what they did was they saved that staircase, which you see in the upper picture, and they saved the front door with those lanterns, which you see in the bottom picture, and they're still there. You cannot go up in the staircase without special permission. People who get married often get their wedding pictures taken on that staircase. If you do get permission, you can go up there, but right now with the COVID, you can't even go in the lobby. This is another so cool thing that very few people take advantage of. It is Washington Tower at Mount Auburn Cemetery. Mount Auburn Cemetery is an awesome place to go regardless of anything else. But at the top of the hill of the cemetery is this Jacob Bigelow designed tower, which has the spiral staircase. And when you get at the top, it has the best view of Boston from the west that you could get anywhere. The views are absolutely unparalleled. It is 360 degrees. It is quite the thing. Very few people go here, so it's quite an adventure. And the other thing I like about it is this is another great place that's very romantic to take your loved one to go up there and have a smooch while you're looking at Boston. The MBTA Command Center. I mean, the T gets a lot of abuse, but they really do have quite the command center. It's in a hidden bomb-proof bunker in the Post Office Square district. They have tours like a few times a year. You have to sign up. Only a few number of people are allowed to go. You have to actually contact them. This is the oldest transportation system in the United States. And when you go down there, you can see them with their mission control-like layout. They can guide all the trains. They can switch the trains. And they have cameras on every platform so they can see crime or they can see what's going on and direct police and so forth. This really is a fascinating tour down below the ground in a secret nondescript building, which you would never even know was there unless you knew where you were going. The good thing about it is that there's a Panera and a Starbucks right next door. This thing is so hidden that I couldn't even find a picture of it. It is a cannon from the Spanish Armada, probably the oldest thing in Boston. Now, you might remember from your history classes that the Spanish Armada sailed to invade England in the 1500s and was sunk by a huge storm before it could do its job. So one of the cannon were dredged up by the English and preserved. After World War II, Winston Churchill came to Boston, and in gratitude for all the work that Massachusetts did in helping England fight the war, he donated this cannon. The cannon is a little bit off to the left of this picture. It's on a pedestal. It's behind a fence where no one can go because of security reasons, but it is enormous. It is an enormous cannon. And when I first learned of it, I ran over to get a picture of it, hopped the fence, took the picture, and got detained by security in like 30 seconds. So you can see it from the street, but it's not easy. But it's a cool hidden thing. This was the second reason that I decided to do this presentation. To me, this is one of the coolest things in Boston. This is a building in Chinatown, located on Washington Street. It's also a tea station. This building was built by a man named David Sears. He was a rich entrepreneur in the 1850s. He tried to take over the public garden, and build mansions for rich people. He failed in that endeavor. So instead, he built this building, which was a banquet house. But this building was built on the site of the Liberty Tree, which was where the colonists would gather to plan their actions against the British when the British occupied Boston. When the British discovered it, they cut the tree down. On this spot, there was a house next to the tree. When they cut the tree down and burned the house down, David Sears later built this building on the spot for wedding banquets, and he built this tree, which is made out of bricks, into the building. Now, 50 years later or so, the area was in decline. This was part of the combat zone. The tree was covered by a billboard, and it was completely forgotten. In the 1960s, the building was going to be torn down. A Boston Herald reporter told the mayor of Boston, whose name I think was Hines at the time, that there was a tree behind the billboard. And the mayor didn't believe him. And he made him a $50 bet that there was no tree back there. And they went on TV, and he went up in a cherry picker and he pulled the sign down. And this building was crumbling. It really was a mess. And there was the tree. And as a result, the building was preserved and saved. It's now a DMV. It's a National Historic Site, and it was preserved. When you walk through Boston, and every time I go down this street, I make a special effort to look up at that tree and all its history and everything it represents. This spot really was the freedom of America, or the idea of America as an independent nation started. This is hard to find too. It's on Stewart Street in Plainview. Many people don't know what they're looking at. It's the Salata Tea Gateway. Salata Tea had its headquarters in Boston here in 1917, and they put up this massive doorway sculpted by Henry Wilson. And what it does is it describes the life cycle of tea as it comes from India all the way to Boston in the invented foiled seal pouch, and they invented the tea bag, and it was a huge thing. Salata went on to be purchased over and over again many times, and it's owned by Harris Tea in New Jersey. And the building is now like an insurance company, I believe. And they did everything possible to preserve this door. And I love going to take a look at it. You go down Boston, Stewart Street, and it is something cool to see. The Boston Bricks. This was a recent art project on Winthrop Street, which is right near King's Chapel. Remember before I told you that if you go to see the #1 fire alarm in America, this street is right near there, along with so many other things. It's 100 bronze bricks that have been sunk into the pavement that depict life in Boston. Some of them are funny, some of them show invention, some of them are serious. And the people walking up and down the street polished them with their feet just by walking over them. This was like put in 2003. It's quite a thing to see on Winthrop Street. The first time I saw this, I was absolutely amazed. This was brought here by Ted Kennedy. This is the largest piece of the Berlin Wall, I believe, in America. It was taken from Berlin after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And we have two sections of the wall. One is at the JFK Library, because Ted Kennedy brought it there in honor of John F. Kennedy, Columbia Point. And there's this one. This is the EF Education Center in Cambridge near Science Park. And this is a circle. You can actually drive around it. You can park for a minute and run out and look at it and touch it if you want to, and it's free. One of the coolest things in Boston are the dioramas at 501 Boylston Street. 501 Boylston Street is currently owned by Pearson Education. You can go there and go into the lobby, and in the lobby are these 4 dioramas that show the phases of Boston history from back when the Indians were there up until when this set of dioramas was made. You can see what's being built here is the Museum of Natural History in the top drawing. And down below, you can see William Blackstone is settling Boston for the first time right around 1630. Thousands and thousands of hours went into making these historically accurate, painstaking models. There's 4 of them. If you happen to be walking down the street in Boston and you want to see something cool, this is well worth seeing. This is also free. This is a really hidden thing in Boston, the site of the first well. This is hidden in an alley on Spring and Water Streets, of course, near the Old South Church, again, near that first fire alarm that I was telling you about. Boston was founded by a man named William Blackston. This was his treasure. He moved away from the Puritans in Charlestown because William Blackston was a nudist and he liked to walk around naked, and the Pilgrims or the Puritans didn't like that very much. So he took over Boston. However, the water in Charlestown was really bad. The Puritans could not make beer, and so they came to Blackston and asked him if they could buy Boston from him so they could get a hold of that spring. That spring was used up until 1855, even though it says 1830 here. Parts of it were still accessible until 1855. Blackston moved to Rhode Island. He came back later. Boston was named after the city of St. Botolph in England, not after Boston, England. The nickname of St. Botolph was Bowtown. This plaque was put up in 1907. It's kind of hard to find, but it's well worth it. Again, as I said earlier, the Arlington Street Church would show up on this little presentation. This thing has the largest collection of Tiffany glass in the entire world. Louis Comfort Tiffany made these panels, and his factory burned down before they completed the job. So there are a couple of windows that don't have them, but you can go in here for free. They do have a guided tour that costs money, but you can go in here, and when the light hits these windows, it is absolutely mesmerizing. The glass is not flat, it's 3D. There are 5 different kinds of glass that are used in the construction of these giant windows. In 1972, a bunch of right-wing nut jobs decided they did not like the religious positions of the church, who are in favor of gay marriage and decriminalizing pot smoking and things like that. So they threw cinder blocks through these windows. So after the windows were repaired, they had to put armor plate over them so you could no longer see them from the outside. They took those armor plates off within the past 5 years. However, last Boston, when the riots came to Boston again, they had to put the armor plate back. So at some point, they will take the armor plate off again, and then you can go in there and see these windows. And it is just an absolutely incredible thing to see. They even let you touch the glass with your fingers. So if you find yourself in Boston and you want to do something free, this is right across from the public garden. It's a cool thing to see. Here's something that is very well hidden. This is a real hidden secret of Boston. It shouldn't be. This is the USS Bennington Memorial. The Bennington was a carrier, an aircraft carrier that was doing carrier launch exercises off Boston Harbor in 1954. And in those days, the catapults were powered by compressed diesel fuel. And something happened, and the compressed diesel fuel exploded, and it killed 300 American sailors. So they made this monument in Boston Harbor for those men. It's at the Charlestown Navy Yard, and it has a little tree garden built around the monument as well. The Navy did not learn its lesson, and the same thing happened to U.S. Enterprise about 10 years later in almost exactly the same spot. And as a result of that, the Navy decided to change their catapult launching system to steam. The Navy Yard is one of the best places to go for any kind of visitor, and it's free. I love this thing so much. I can't even begin to tell you how excited I get whenever I go here. It's probably not proper. This is the Chestnut Hill pumping station at the end of Cleveland Circle. It's on the reservoir in Brookline. It was going to be torn down to make condos. A lot of the place was torn down and was made into condos, but this was preserved. These engines, these giant steam engines, are called cathedral engines. They're the same type of engines that were used in the Titanic, and they were used to pump water that came from Cochituate into the little reservoir and go to Boston. Naturally, when steam power went out and other methods of pumping came, the building was abandoned and it was just left there. The architecture inside, other than the steam engines, is so incredibly intricate that it is well worth going to see. that the people who built this loved what they were doing so much that they made pipes out of brick to decorate the walls with little brick valves just for the way it looked. And in those days, nobody was going to even see it except for the people that worked there. Now, there has been talk of some kind of device with compressed air that would allow these engines to work again for demonstration purposes to show people how they worked. And that would be an amazing thing. But I don't think they have the money to do it. But if you have a chance to go here, it's beautiful. If you like that kind of period, the Victorian period, this technology is phenomenal. This is a relatively new thing. The Church of the Covenant in Back Bay. The pastor of this church in the 1890s went to the Columbian exhibition, fell in love with this Tiffany lamp, and bought it on the spot, even though he didn't have the money to do it. He came back and raised the money through his church, and they built the church around this lamp. They, along with the Arlington Street Church, have the largest Tiffany glass collections in the world. So this is something that's worth seeing. And an interesting note, a few years ago, some thieves smashed one of the windows to break in and buy a few dollars, to steal a few dollars worth of computers, when the window itself cost $63,000 to repair. They had no idea what they were doing. Boston is the most burned down city in the world. There are many books about the burning of Boston. The latest is Burn Boston Burn. But there are a lot of books that you can get that tell the history of Boston burning down. The big fire that we still talk about is the fire of 1872 that started on Summer Street in the financial district and burned down billions of dollars worth of real estate, started in a hat and a hoop shop. And in those days, everyone thought the area was completely fireproof because all the buildings were made out of granite. However, the roofs were made out of wood shaped like mansards. And once they got going, the fire couldn't be stopped, and they learned a dangerous lesson. The lesson was that when granite gets hot enough, it explodes like a bomb. And all those granite buildings exploded, throwing heavy rocks and fire everywhere they went. At the time of the fire, there was a horse distemper disease going around. There were no horses to pull the fire engines. They weighed up to 6 tons. They required 100 men to pull them to the fire. The fire could be seen all the way up to Maine. The chief of police at the time, chief of the fire at the time, John Damrell, who was a real hero, warned and warned and warned that this was going to happen. No one listened to him. And when the fire was over, they blamed him. This is on Cambridge Street. It's the site of Alexander Graham Bell's laboratory. It's right at the foot of the JFK building on Cambridge Street, those two buildings that stand right next to each other on City Hall Plaza. There's a little monument that's right there. This is where Alexander Graham Bell said, "Washington, come here. I need you." Really hard to find this monument, actually. It's hidden by some trees set back from the street. It's on a street. Cambridge Street has many interesting things to see on it as well, and this is one of them. The Nursing Sundial is a recent addition to Boston. It's also very hard to find. It's at the Mass General Hospital, which you see in the top picture. It's in the courtyard of that building. That was a George Bullfinch designed building. It was the third oldest hospital in America. They still use that building as part of the hospital. And in the common is this sundial. And you can see in the gnomon, there are 3 figures. The little figure is supposed to be Florence Nightingale, who got her reputation at the Battle of Crimea, where the charge of the Light Brigade happened. As a nurse, she's holding up a lamp showing lighting the way of nursing to the future. She also is represented by the goddess Athena. The second one is Aphrodite. She is holding up a book to show that nursing is about education. And the third one is supposed to be Diana, the goddess of wisdom, who is holding up a globe showing that nursing is global and that nurses serve everyone and are made up of everyone. So this is an interesting thing to go see as well. And there are a lot of interesting things at the Mass General Library, like the Ether Dome and this building and the Japanese Peace Garden and so on. The site of the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, most people know that there was a 2.5 million gallon tank of hot molasses stored in the North End. It was the largest tank in America, if not the world at the time, and it had never been filled up to the top, except this one day. And then when it was filled up to the top, it collapsed and a tidal wave of molasses rolled around the North End, knocking down trains and buildings and killing people and horses. It was a terrible thing. They had to wash it away with fire hoses. And they said that up until the 1960s, when it got hot out in Boston, the molasses would come up out of the cobblestones. So there are a lot of things to see in this area. This thing here is a badly vandalized monument to the radio operators who worked out of the islands in Boston Harbor during World War II to help save stricken ships that had sunk by the U-boats. The Nantucket Lightship is very close to my heart. I am a member of the Nantucket Lightship Society. The lightships were a group of ships that were stationed around America where it was infeasible to put a real lighthouse. This lightship was the biggest of them all. It was off Nantucket, and it was called the Liberty Lightship because after it was placed there, this was the first thing that immigrants saw when they came to America, not the Statue of Liberty. This ship was made in 1936 after its sister was run over and sunk by the RMS Olympic, the sister ship to the Titanic, on its final run to be broken up in England. Most of the sailors were killed. The ship replaced it. This ship is now a historic landmark. There's a commission that does everything it can to preserve it. They're way short of money. They would love to get the engines going again. It's a very interesting tour, and everything on it is original. One of the cool things about it is on a pier in East Boston is the absolute best place to see the fireworks over Boston, in Boston. If you get a chance, fireworks are coming, get on the Blue Line, get off at Maverick, walk to the waterfront, take a seat and watch them and see this ship. These are the Charles River locks, close to my heart. So what happened is they kind of killed Boston's sewage system when they decided to build a dam across the Charles River back in the 1840s or somewhere around there. Without the tides, all the sewage that Boston had sank in the mill pond and really stunk up the city, which is one of the reasons why they made Back Bay. They filled in the pond to get rid of all that sewage. These locks allow the ships to go back and forth into the from the harbor into the city. And it's very interesting is that it is a cut through from the park on the right, which is Paul Revere Park, to downtown Boston on the left. And you can stand there and watch the locks work and the ships go in and out. It's a very interesting thing to see. It's like part of hidden Boston. There are a lot of other cool things in that area as well. That bridge in the foreground is the Charles River Bridge. The Charlestown Bridge at one time was the longest bridge in the entire world. It's now been torn down. They're replacing it. It was supposed to be replaced as part of the big dig, but they ran out of money. But now it's in such bad shape that they finally did have to tear it down and replace it. This ugly building is quite famous, actually, and it hides a lot of history. Behind it is a tiny monument that shows where Paul Revere stepped out of his boat after leaving from Boston to go alert the Patriots that the regulars were coming from England. And in front of that monument is this building that was part of the Tudor stores. Frederick Tudor was the man who invented refrigerated shipping and made it possible for us to get fruits and vegetables from around the world. It led to the UFC. It was where the word Banana Republic was actually invented because the governments of South America at the time were so bad, they contracted to the UFC to run the governments who didn't really do a very good job. So this building has walls 24 inches thick to hold the cold in. Then Tudor would go out and he would cut ice, which he got for free, fill up this building with ice, and then he could sell the ice in South America for fruits and vegetables. The people in South America saw ice. They couldn't believe their eyes. They wanted the ice. They had never seen ice before. So they found out that they could cool their gin and tonics. It was really very cool. This building is now owned by the National Park Service. It says NHS, but it should be the National Park Service. And they were going to put their headquarters there until they realized that the building is slipping into the water and they don't know what to do, whether they should tear it down or spend a lot of money to save it. I don't know what's going to happen either. It's right on the Charlestown Navy Yard, and the Constitution is right behind that as well. This is the site of the first train line in America, opened up in the 1920s. It was used until the 1960s. There's a big quarry up there, the Quincy Quarries, and it was used to move the quarry granite down to the Neponset River, where it was shipped out on barges to be used all over the world. So at the top of this ramp, you can still walk up there. You can still see the tracks, is the Lyons Turning Mill, where they made giant stone pillars like the stone pillars on Faneuil Hall. This was the first commercial railroad in America. It was also the scene of the first railroad deaths in the world, because what happened was tourists would come from Boston, they'd get on the carts would go up, get loaded with granite, and then they'd go back down. And it turns out that you can't see it, but on the back side of this picture is a cliff. And one day the chain broke and the train went all the way down that hill and went off the cliff, and 12 people died. This is I believe, the last slide. Thank you for listening. This is the calf pasture pumping station. This one is very, very close to my heart. This was the state-of-the-art model sewage pumping station for Boston, built in 1856 to take out all the poo and dump it in the harbor on high tide. And hopefully it would have been taken out to sea, but it never was. It always ended up back on the beaches of Boston. It was used until 1966, but it was destroying the entire harbor. The harbor was as dead as the moon. So it's been closed since 1966. It's owned by UMass. They're ripping out the guts now, and they're going to probably make dorms out of it. It is a beautiful building. You can see it's like Frankenstein's castle. It's filled with all kinds of ancient machinery. And I have to point out that it is the site of my Boston-based novel, Calf Pasture Pumping Station, which I highly recommend you go on Amazon and buy and review. So that is the end of my presentation. I've gone 15 minutes over, and I really, really apologize, but I get so excited doing this. I hope you liked it. I hope that you have some questions, comments. I don't know everything. If I've made a mistake or you want to criticize, please feel free. And if you know of something cool that I can add to other presentations, do that as well. This series has 8 parts. There are 2 more parts of Hidden Boston. And if we decide to do this again, I hope you will join me for that. Thank you.
So Jay, keep your current slide up. So keep your slideshow up. Thank you so much. Don't worry about going over. You packed a lot of information in. And you really went an hour, because I had to start about 10 minutes late. So let's take about 7 minutes of questions here. We got a lot. So let me see here. Bear with me. Elaine wants to know, are Ames shovels still being made today?
Yes.
Mike wants to know, is this the same Ames family from Lowell and Lawrence Mills?
That I do not know.
Christopher mentions that Paul Revere was able to identify the body of Joseph Warren at Bunker Hill using dental records.
I don't think it was Paul Revere who did that. And yes, I know he did do it by his teeth, but I don't think he used records. So the body was mutilated by the British at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was identified by the vest he was wearing.
Elaine wants to know, where is Pie Alley?
Okay, Pie Alley is located on School Street, right next to Old City Hall, which is an area where there's so much going on. And it's called Pie Alley because there used to be a lot of night restaurants there. That was Newspaper Row, where all newspapers were made. And the letters that they're used to print newspaper are called pie. And when the newspaper men would go to get their food, they would reach in their pockets to get their wallet, and the letters would fall out on the ground and be ground into the dirt. In fact, they were still finding them up until the 1960s. Pie Alley was famous because it was the last place in America that was still selling cat pie made from stray cats.
Alexander wants to know, what's the name of the museum in Rhode Island that has the Bell mural?
I have forgotten. It's in Newport. Just doing research on that recently, and I have forgotten the name of the museum. I apologize. Oh, I'm failing miserably.
No, 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 don't worry about it. You know where it is anyway. Mary wants to know, where is Bay Village?
Oh, Bay Village is right behind Park Plaza. One side is bordered by the theater district where the Wang and the Wilbur and the Schubert, and the other side is bordered by the Copley, the Park Plaza Hotel and parking garage where Legal Seafoods is, and then it's bordered by the Mass Pike. It is one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in Boston. Very beautiful, very expensive. Boy, if I had money, I would live there.
Christopher notes that the Coconut Grove fire also led to requiring push-out doors and lighted exit signs.
Yes, the doors have to be on either side of any rotating door because of that, yes.
Alexander asks, do most cities have models like Boston does?
I believe they do. I don't know that for a fact, but I know New York does.
Robert wants to know, isn't there a full-scale replica of the Liberty Bell at the State House in Boston?
I've never seen that, and I've taken the tour. The tour is free, but I've never seen a full-scale model of the Liberty Bell there. I could be wrong, but I don't recall that.
Lee says that she was at Arlington St. Church on Thursday, but it didn't look like you could get in. It seemed locked up, probably due to COVID, I would imagine.
Oh, yeah. I have to make a caveat that all of these presentations and all of these places assume there's no COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
I put a note in the chat saying that the Tewksbury Library actually hosted the author of Burn, Boston, Burn last month. And I dropped the YouTube link in the chat if folks want to watch that interview. Let's see.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Boston's fire history is absolutely amazing. It turns out that the head of the state police fire marshal's unit was the head of the arson ring that was burning Boston down in 1982.
Yeah, and the author of that book, Wayne Miller, he worked for the ATF, and he investigated all those fires. Robert says, up until a few years ago, there was a payphone next to the bell phone statue that was always broken. I'm not kidding.
Wouldn't surprise me.
So Susan says, excellent presentation, thank you. Michelle says, this was so interesting, thank you. Ryan says, great presentation. Leanne says, this was great. Kathy says, excellent presentation. Your enthusiasm was wonderful. Mary says, wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and about 10 exclamation points. Thank you, Jay. Very well done, says Francis. Thanks so much for a very interesting presentation. So Renee asks, can you tell us anything about the Women's Educational and Industrial Union? The building was, and maybe still is, on Boylston Street in Boston, decorated in the front with iron black swans.
I cannot, and this really bothers me because I'm a volunteer for Boston by Foot, and that's all they do is talk about the architecture in those buildings, and I don't know that building at all, so I'll do some research.
Barbara
My
says,
education never ends. I don't know everything.
There you go. Barbara says the memorial to the Coconut Grove fire was originally proposed for Statler Park. Am I pronouncing that right?
Yes, Statler Park is right there in Park Plaza. It's a beautiful little park.
Dory says, thank you for the very interesting presentation. Shinwei says, thank you so much for this wonderful, this insightful presentation. Bernadette, thank you, Mr. Bazzanati and friends of the Tewksbury Library. This was very inspiring for future visits to Boston. Vinny says, UMass Boston first began in Park Plaza. June says, thanks for informing us about many little-known events and sites. Mariette says, thank you for a wonderful program. Betty says, thank you, Jay. It was a great program. Mary says, looking forward to visiting these sites. Pat says, learned so much, thank you. Christine says, thank you for a wonderful presentation. Gail says, thank you. Judith says, thank you. Jill says, terrific presentation. And Mariette encourages people to join the Friends of the Tewksbury Library, which sponsors programs like this. So Jay, we've hit 3:15. Do you have any last words of wisdom to the group? Anything else you want to say before we wrap up?
I hope you'll come to part 2 if Robert decides to do it.
Yeah, we'll have to figure that out, Jay, but I'm sure we'll definitely host you. We'll definitely host part 2. It's just a matter of fitting you into a future schedule here. But
Absolutely.
we will make that happen. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Look for that email tomorrow with the feedback survey. Please fill that out when you have the chance. Thanks again, Jay. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll be ending the call in about 10 seconds here.